Here are 5 wonderful books by 5 incredible authors you may never have even heard of. These are 5 authors whom I absolutely adore and I think deserve way more attention than they get. I was inspired to make this video when I fell back into fantasy recently, and one of my absolute favourite fantasy authors is Chris Wooding. Chris Wooding feels like a very strange anomaly in the world of fantasy fiction. He's a cishet white guy who writes really good fantasy books, so it's always felt weird to me that he's never reached the heights of someone like Brandon Sanderson. He's not exactly a niche writer, and yet talk to any fantasy fan and there's a really good chance they've never heard of him, or at least never read him. And he deserves so much more love and attention. When I was in my early 20s, I discovered his rip-roaring adventurous steampunk fantasy series, The Ketty J. The titular Ketty J is an airship, and in that series of 4 steampunk fantasy books, which begin with Retribution Falls, we follow the crew of the Ketty J on several different adventures. If you were one of those millennials that grew up on Firefly and was always angry that it was cancelled, like me, these books fill that niche. In fact, they're better than Firefly. They have better world building, better character writing, better story arcs and character arcs specifically. They are wonderful adventure stories that follow a really lovable but very, very dysfunctional crew of sky pirates. They take on mostly illegal and very dangerous jobs, and through their work we follow along on these wonderful adventures and uncover the world, its history, its lore, its religion, and also very importantly the backstories and futures of the crew of the Ketty J. And you grow to so love these people. The captain of the Ketty J is a man called Darian Frey, and perhaps my favourite thing about the whole series is his relationship to his ex-fiancée. He left a woman at the altar before the books began, and she was so angry about this that she also went off and became a sky pirate, but she ended up becoming queen of all of the sky pirates. She's this absolutely wild, badass, assassin queen pirate lady. I love her to pieces. And she kind of weaves in and out throughout the series, becoming a bigger and more important character as she and Darian's relationship kind of maybe gets fixed, possibly. She's so wonderful, and the jilting at the altar to Sky Pirate Queen pipeline is just so great. And then we have the Ember Blade. This is an 800-page, pretty traditional fantasy epic. This book is Chris Wooding's Lord of the Rings. It is him attempting a true homage to the history, to the origins of the fantasy genre. He has created an enormous world in scale and scope. But my favorite thing about Wooding is the way that he writes his characters and their relationships and their dialogue. And having that all carried over into such an enormous epic is a real treat. Go back and read Lord of the Rings. The dialogue is pretty terrible, the character relationships are almost non-existent, and so this feels like a Lord of the Rings for the 21st century, where the characters are a lot more rough, three-dimensional. They make it rewarding to learn to love and understand them, and their relationships with each other are so charming and interesting. Wooding is one of the great modern fantasy authors, and he gets almost no attention. It baffles me. Now, if you've been watching this channel for a long time, you know that I'm a huge fan of Japanese fiction. And one Japanese author that I discovered last year who I think deserves so much more attention is Hiroki Takahashi. And Fingerbone is a hard-hitting novella set during World War II, translated by Takumi Nieda, who is also a wonderful Japanese to English translator. There's a lot of good war fiction out there, and I kind of surprised myself by being quite a big fan of fiction set during wartime. Alice Wynn's In Memoriam was one of my favourite books of last year. I'm a huge fan of All the Light We Cannot See by Anthony Doerr, not sure. But it's not very often that we get war fiction by a Japanese author translated into English, so I think that makes this really, really special. Fingerbone is set in the jungle of Papua New Guinea, and over the course of just 120 pages, we follow the life and current circumstances of an unnamed narrator who spends about half of the novel in a war hospital in the jungle. Fingerbone is very much a novel about the front lines, about the people who actually fought and died in the war. It is not about politics. But then I guess in that way it is also very much about politics. Or maybe it's fairer to say it's about ethics and philosophy, because it is exploring the ethics of war. The book's title, Fingerbone, is about a tradition in which if a soldier dies, another soldier will honor them by taking a fingerbone of theirs back to their family, and that's what happens in the book. If you're a fan of Japanese fiction, if you find yourself reading a lot of great Japanese novelists, Hiroki Takahashi deserves to be on your bookshelf. And I feel like it's pretty likely he isn't. And that also goes for anyone who enjoys war fiction. If you find yourself with a shelf lined with World War I and II novels, make sure this is on that shelf. This is a book I've talked about quite a lot this year, and that's because I really want to hammer home how important it is that people go out and read it, and I know they're not. I don't see this book talked about anywhere, and it is one of my favourite books of 2024. This is Aftershock by Chinese author Zhang Ling. It was translated spectacularly into English by Shelley Bryant, and oh my word, this is such a wonderful family epic. It's only 200 pages long, and yet epic feels like the right word to use here. We begin in Canada in the modern day. Our protagonist is a Chinese woman with a Chinese husband. They have a daughter together, and they emigrated to Canada quite a few years ago. She and her husband are both writers, and when the book begins, she's at her therapist's office. She is not doing well. Her relationship to her husband and her child, it's all falling apart, and over the course of the novel we learn her entire life history, even the story of her mother from before the protagonist was born. And their entire family history revolves around an earthquake that really did happen. In 1976, an enormous earthquake shook the city of Tangshan, which is not too far from Beijing. Many people died, even more were displaced, and that includes this family. So the novel begins with her mother growing up in the Cultural Revolution, and then we move into the 70s with our protagonist as a young girl, and we continue on until we get back to the present day. I so adored this book. It is an absolute masterpiece of modern Chinese fiction. I've got a review of it if you want to go and watch it, but this is brand new out in English translation this year, and I really need more people to pay attention to this, to talk about it, to spread the word. This is one of my favorite Chinese novels now, and it is not getting the attention it deserves. If you enjoy family drama, if you enjoy a bit of modern history, if you enjoy Chinese history and politics, if you like generational stories as well, there's so much in here to enjoy, and it's only 200 pages long. I really need people to pay attention to this book. Aftershock is incredible. Now, anyone who knows me even a little bit knows how much I love Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. I talk about that book every chance that I get. I have a Frankenstein tattoo. I named my cat after her mother. I'm obsessed. This next book is not Frankenstein. But I am glad that I get to talk about Frankenstein in this video. I can't lie about that. This is Mary, or The Birth of Frankenstein by Dutch author Anne Eickhout. This novel was published in late 2023, and I'm pretty sure it ended up being my favourite book in translation of last year. It was translated into English by Laura Watkinson, and this is a starkly gorgeous work of sapphic historical fiction, which tells two different stories of the early life of Mary Shelley. Other than the fact that she's the daughter of a great feminist philosopher, perhaps the most famous thing about Mary Shelley, the thing that everyone knows, is that summer that she spent at the edge of Lake Geneva with her husband, the poet Percy Shelley, their friend, the poet Lord Byron, and their doctor, all sitting around a campfire telling ghost stories, and her ghost story ended up evolving into Frankenstein. One of the stories in here is the story of that summer, but it is told in a way that you have never seen it told before. It genuinely opened my eyes to seeing Frankenstein in a slightly different way, even as someone who's read it 1,000 times and loves it to pieces. Because in that story, this novel focuses on the emptiness and the trauma and the sheer sadness that Mary Shelley was feeling after losing her child, and becoming obsessed with the idea that her son William will also die. And this fear, this paranoia, this loss, it all informed Frankenstein. But that's only one of the two stories in here. The other story is about another summer which occurred 4 or 5 years earlier when Mary Shelley was in her middle teen years. She spent a summer in rural Scotland with a family friend because she wasn't feeling well and people used to go off to the countryside and take in the air and all of that. Her father sent her up to Scotland, and there she meets a young girl her own age. And this story is full of strange folklore and little adventures that they go on. Weird things happen in this story, but as I said, this is also a tale of sapphic love. These two girls form a romantic connection. And there is strong reason to believe that Mary Shelley was bisexual, and this novel really leans into that idea by showing a 15-year-old Mary enjoying a kind of sapphic romantic awakening. It's really gorgeous. When it comes to sapphic historical or gothic fiction, we are all familiar with names like Sarah Waters and Julia Armfield, but Anne Eickhout deserves to be amongst those names. She is an incredible Dutch author, and this is such a fantastic novel. And once again, this is a book that I've seen nobody else talk about. I am the only person that I know who has read and loved this book. Please read this novel, show Anne Eickhout some love. It is majestic. This last author might seem like a bit of a weird choice, and you'll understand why in a second. I really didn't love The Puzzlewood by Rosie Andrews. I was pretty disappointed by it. I enjoyed it as a work of gothic fiction. It was fine, it felt a little bit rote, it was very poorly paced, and its characterization left a lot to be desired. It's certainly not bad, but it was disappointing. And I think that's mostly because of how much I loved her debut novel, The Leviathan. I so adored this book. And Rosie Andrews is another one of those authors that no one seems to know or pay enough attention to. The Leviathan is another wonderful work of gothic historical fiction, and I think about this book all the time for one main reason. And that reason is that The Leviathan is so wonderfully camp. Honestly and strangely, for something so dark and gothic, there is almost a pageantry to this thing. It is cabaret in its campness. The Leviathan is nothing at all like the Rocky Horror Picture Show in terms of its themes or its characters or its events or really anything. And yet that's what I kind of think of as a comparison because, well, Rocky Horror owes so much to the Gothic and to horror, and this is a work of Gothic historical fiction, and much like Rocky Horror, it is such a wonderfully camp thing, almost in a tongue-in-cheek kind of a way. And The Puzzlewood didn't have any of that, unfortunately. The Leviathan is set in the 17th century during the English Civil War, and it follows a soldier who comes home. Okay, I'm about ready to scream. I have been fighting with the light all video. Ever since moving here, I have battled with the sun in every video I have ever made. I'm so sick of it. I've got a ring light, I've got the blinds closed, and yet, oh, it's a nightmare. You don't need to know, but let's just say filming takes a lot longer than it should. Civil War soldier comes home, his sister says that their new maid is seducing their widowed father. And where we go from here is absolutely bonkers, especially considering we also occasionally jump really far forward in time to where our protagonist is an old man, and in the attic of his house is some kind of a monster that he periodically goes upstairs to feed. And somewhere along the line, these two stories are going to come together. The young man who comes home to a conspiracy about his father's maid, and the old man with a monster in his attic. What happens in the middle? Well, you can read it and find out for yourself. Andrews' second novel, The Puzzlewood, might not have really done much for me, but this thing, her first novel, oh my god. When I talk to people who love gothic and historical fiction, so often the same names get listed off again and again and again, and nobody brings up Rosie Andrews. So I'm doing it here to remind you that if you love gothic and historical fiction, you must read this thing. It is so much fun. I really hope you enjoyed this little list of 5 books you may never have heard of. I'm gonna go scream at the sun for a while.
Shut up about the sun! Shut up about the sun!
But before I do, there is one other author you may not have heard of until now, and that's me. If you want to pick up a copy of my book, there are links in the description. If you like queer horror stories, that's what these are. A beautiful, horrible collection of queer horror tales that I am very, very proud of. Subscribe for books.